Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm gonna sum up the first 4 videos on what is compliance. I'm gonna do that to try to clarify the complexity of compliance, because we've been into different fields and it might seem overwhelming what compliance really is, what your compliance commitment should be, and how broad the scope of compliance is. So I'm just gonna try to pin out like the silver line just so you can see that it might be complex, but there is a meaning to it all. So we started out with talking about what is compliance. First, we had the history behind it, the rise of compliance, looking at its different events, its different legal structures that created the system that we are in now, the risk-based system. Then we went in to say, okay, so let's define compliance. We focused on the reactive compliance, which is typically the historical way of regulatory compliance, where you only looked at the rules and then you assessed the rules to say, okay, do we comply or not? But you could like take each rule by like a singularity process where you could say, okay, am I complying to this rule, this rule? You didn't have the whole picture. So when it comes to dynamic compliance, we broaden this scope because we don't limit our definition of compliance towards the regulatory regime of only having to address external factors. We also address internal factors. So whenever there's a regulatory requirement towards an entity, a bank, a hospital, anywhere within the risk-based regulatory regime, then we should consider ourselves as part of the problem, because the incentives for regulators to come in, well, it derives from a behavior of the sector and maybe also the company that we represent, the entity we represent. The same accounts if we take in a state view, a member state view, that there might come some legislation that really is trying to emphasize some misbehavior or misunderstandings between member states. We've seen it on the money laundering directives, where cooperation in the 5th directive was really pinpointed high out because there was a lack of cooperation between member states. So we need to focus on the behavior. So the behavior of each entity depends on how it's structured, and how we should conceive compliance is that we need to take the actor and we need to align the behavior of each actor. It might be an entity, state, whatever, it might be different actors, and this behavior need to align with the norms of society, with the regulation and the requirements, both internally and externally. So you need to align with your core competences, your core values, to the external factors, your internal processes with your external factors and regulation at the same time. So when we talked about, we defined compliance as this new dynamic compliance where we put in internal factors on top of the external factors. And then we divided compliance into 3 different segments, or 3 different key factors, which was norm aim, which is the aim, the core values of an entity, the regulatory compliance, which we know from reactive compliance, and then the technical part, the last yellow part, which is more of the operational kind. And in the middle, the mixture of all these 3 elements, we see that this is balancing these different parts is what compliance is about. It's about aligning what entity you are according to the requirements and the regulation of society, also the norm of society. So it's not just your individual aim, but it's also the society's norm with your operational side, which might also be limited in some kind, especially in terms of technology. Then we looked at who has to comply. And here, the conclusion was everyone. Even persons, clients, customers in the end of a value chain. Well, it's because dynamic compliance is a new way of seeing things. It's a systemic point of view, and we have to address our actions. So we can take it at every level. We can look at compliance international, supranational, national, and also entities and persons. So you can kind of apply this whole thinking of saying, okay, who am I as a person? What are my key goals? What are my operational limitations? The technical. What does the law require me to do? Not speeding, for example. So how am I going to align? If I want to be a good citizen, I should not speed. Do I even have a car? My technical compliance. Do I even have that ability to not speed? We all do. But it's just an example to say that you can take the same element of progress and try to align your personal self-compliance as you can with entities, nations, supranational and internationally. Because in the end, we all have core values. We all have something that defines who we are. And you can look at two different countries and they will have a fundamental core that they might be similar in some senses, but you will find differences in historical approaches to how they do politics, legal backgrounds, also their economic policy. There are so many ways in which even member states within the EU differ from each other. And that goes all the way down. What are the biggest industries in the country? And that might also affect how we regulate. So there are so many factors. So when we address who should think about compliance, it is actually everyone. So, but of course, if you're sitting in a company, you can limit yourself to say like, okay, I'm going to look at compliance issues from my perspective. But just know that everyone has to do the same procedure that you have to do. At the end, we talked about, so what is the extent of compliance? How far should I go? Can I just have like one compliance officer and then that's enough? And it depends. It depends on your core values, your aim, your purpose in life. Here I'm talking also corporation, nations, etc. So if you have really high standards, you might want to hire more people to secure that you're compliant all the way through the process or the value chain. Because if you take really hard stance on certain political areas, then you have to secure your way out to avoid shitstorm from society or even to be sure of the regulatory demands. The value chain. Well, the more suppliers you have, the harder it is to be consequent in your compliance commitment. But as long as you stay true and you know what you know, which information you don't, and you can strategize upon the risk that they might have as inherent risk in itself for being non-compliant, then you can assess what is needed. Then you have impact size. There's something about size that does matter. We didn't address it, but it's also just a fun fact to see. Like if we look with tax glasses on, it is funny to see that most of the jurisdictions that are somehow conceived as tax havens, they are really, really small states or nations or jurisdictions somewhere in the world. And that might be because there's not been a lot of control or surveillance or supervision with the actions on these states. And that might increase in the future due to the high risk that they give, that they impose on society, given the tax policies that they have. Of course, reputation, you have to be aware of reputation. You have to be able to take care of a shitstorm. You have to have a backup plan. And there, if you have made your compliance assessment and aligned your core values with your value chains, with your impact size, then getting out of a shitstorm due to reputation from society or something that goes wrong is much easier, because you know where something went wrong in the aligning process and your compliance commitment. At the same time, as I mentioned, be aware of branding, because the more you brand yourself on some issues that are sensitive or that can have a big drawback in case you're not compliant, the more secure you need to be on, and the higher commitment you need to have on that area in terms of compliance. And your social responsibilities. Don't go out and say you're socially responsible if you're not. You cannot just pretend that you're doing CSR. You need to actually align. We are in a new era where you cannot just buy out your sins. You actually have to act what you're doing and show it. So this was just a wrap-up summary of the first 4 videos regarding what is compliance. So stay tuned, follow the channel, and let's talk more about compliance.